Welcome back, folks. We did a discussion on the Solaris 11 zones already. In this segment, we intend to take that discussion further to understand how we could add resources to a zone that exists on a Solaris 11 machine. I'm on the machine where we created our first zone, which we named as Zone A. Let's list the zones that exist on the system. As you can see, the Zone A with an ID 1 is in the running state. If we would like to know the information related to the zone, such as what resources are added to the zone, we can make use of the command zonecfg minus zzone info. From the output, it's very evident that there is only one resource that is currently added to the zone, which is the net 1 resource that happens to be a physical port. We would like to enhance the capability of the zone by adding more resources, such as a shared directory from the global zone, maybe a UFS file system, maybe in a ZFS file system. We would also like to restrict the usage of physical memory within the non-global zone, as well as limit the number of GPUs that are added to the non-global zone. So in essence, what we plan to do in this episode is to control the resources in non-global zone, making it a real container. Let's go ahead and do that. This is my global zone. As you can see from the zone name output, I have a directory by the name bundles in here. I have a few test files inside bundles directory, which I have named using some these are just files. In fact, I have given it some names such as MySQL packages, softwares, so that we simulate the idea that we want to share a directory that has some softwares in it. Maybe this is a directory that I want to make available in non-global zone as well. That's the whole idea. At this stage of our discussion, there is no directory in the non-global zone that has these softwares from the global zone. So again, let me reiterate what we are trying to do here. Imagine there is a directory in your global zone that you would like to share with your non-global zone, and we're going to achieve that by adding a resource into the non-global zone. Before we add the resource into the non-global zone, let's just log in to the non-global zone, which is Zone A. I have to remind you that last time we logged into the non-global zone, we used a -Z option, in fact -C option to log into the non-global zone. That was to capture the console of the non-global zone so that we could go through the system identification process. Now that we have identified the non-global zone with its host name, IP address, netmask, DNS, all those details, we no longer have to capture the console of the non-global zone. We can just log in without using the -C option there. So let me just log into the non-global zone and run the command df-h. Maybe we might want to take a closer look at the file systems and the directories that are mounted. Let's say there is no directory by the name shared or softwares for that matter. Maybe we would use that directory as the mount point to mount the shared directory from the global zone. So we don't have any such directories as softwares or bundles or whatever. These are the system directories that we got when we configured and installed the zone for the first time. I clear the screen and maybe exit out of the zone, and I'm going to configure the zone to get the bundles directory and its contents from the global zone. I have to remind you that we are in the global zone there, and the global zone has a directory called /bundles. We would like to make this directory available in the non-global zone, Zone A. Let's go ahead and do that. I had made a mention when we did the part 1 of the non-global zone that adding a resource uses a pattern. We go to the zonecfg command to configure the zone, and then we say add a specific resource type, and our prompt, the command prompt, scopes itself to that specific resource type, and then we set properties of that resource. To help you recollect what we did in the part 1, we added a network port, and we did that by running the command add network. That was the zonecfg subcommand, and then we specified the properties of the network, such as set physical is equal to etc. It's the same pattern that we would follow for all the resources. So it's very important that you keep this pattern in your mind, and as long as you know this pattern, you would be able to add any resources to the zone. In the end, what additional thing would you do in the zone? Basically, it's about managing the resource within the zone. A zone is going to be treated as a dedicated operating system instance. So one of the important tasks you perform in the non-global zone in Solaris 11 operating system is about adding and removing resources from that zone. So the first resource that we're going to add to the non-global zone, zone A, is a directory from the global zone, which is bundles. So let's go ahead and do that. I run the command zone cfg -z zone A. You would remember that it takes me into the interactive mode of the zone cfg command. I'm going to add a resource. The resource that I want to add is a file system. Of course, it's a directory from the global zone that is nothing but a file system of a specific type, which happens to be LOFS, loopback file system. It's a directory in the global zone, so obviously it's not a UFS file system or an ZFS file system. It happens to be a loopback file system. So again, you can recollect the pattern here. The pattern is about adding a resource. What type of resource am I adding here? It's FS, file system. Then you can see the scope of my zone CFG command has now changed. It's inside the file system scope. I'm setting a property of that file system, which happens to be type. I would say set special is equal to what is the directory in the global zone that I would like to share with the non-global zone. You would remember it to be bundles. That's the directory from the global zone you want to share with the non-global zone. The next attribute obviously is where do you want this specific directory to be available in the non-global zone. That is determined by another attribute called dir. So if I say, let's say softwares, remember we had a look at the df-h output of the zone when we booted the zone and when we logged into the zone, and we also observed that there was never a directory by the name softwares in there. So we are saying /softwares is the mount point where you would like to have the contents of the bundles mounted in the non-global zone. You can also specify set options is equal to RO if you want to. That means it's read-only. Of course, it's by default. Regardless of whether you say RO or not, a loopback file system such as this is read-only. So I am specifying this to be read-only so that from within the non-global zone you cannot make any kind of modifications to this. If you are through with the resource, then I can say end. Now this is exactly the pattern that I would like to help you recollect again. The pattern is something that you might want to keep in mind. I'm adding a resource. In this case, the resource is file system. And when I do that, I am within the scope of that specific resource. And then you're setting properties that are very specific to that resource, in this case, the file system. So here, the file system type is LOFS. The directory that you want to share from the global zone is indicated by the special attribute there. The mount point where you want that to be made available within the non-global zone is dir. And then you're specifying options is equal to RO. I think I made I had a slip of tongue when I specified that the default is read-only. That is not true. In fact, you would be able to make modifications to the /softwares directory from the non-global zone, which is a reason why I specify here as RO. Now that I'm through with this, I can say exit. Remember, when I do exit, I'm literally committing the changes that I've made into the zone configuration file. In case if you're not able to recollect where that file is, it's under /etc zones directory, and you can see the file to be zone a.xml. We mentioned this again and again last time that you should not be hand editing the zone a.xml file. If you want to make modifications to the file, always make use of the zone cfg command. We'll go ahead and look at zone A's configuration file by using zone cfg. Remember info. Of course, you can see there is now a bit of a difference here. You now have an additional resource added to the zone, and that is nothing but a directory from the global zone In the global zone, that directory is /bundles. That's going to be made available under /softwares directory in the non-global zone. I would go for a reboot of the zone here because I've made changes to the zone configuration file. But if you cannot afford a reboot, which in many cases you cannot, you can always use the mount command from the global zone to mount this without rebooting the zone. We'll come back to that later. I'm going to reboot the system. Zone ADM -Z, zone A reboot. Again, it'll go through different states. It'll in fact go to the installed state, then ready state and running state. And when it is in the running state, I'll get my prompt back. Then we can log into the zone and verify whether there is a directory by the name /softwares exist, which has the contents of the /bundles from the global zone. We'll verify the state of the zone by running zone ADM list -cv. Zone A is in running state. Remember, we mentioned it in the last time that the ID of only the global zone is going to be constant as 0. When you try to reboot the zone, or whenever you do a reboot of the zone, the ID of the non-global zones changes, and there is a daemon called zone ADM D daemon that's responsible for assigning these IDs. Earlier the ID of the zone was 1, now it is 2, and that is why the name of the zone is important. The kernel identifies the zone by its name and not by the ID, unlike the users we have in Unix. Let's log into the zone and run the df-h command. This time around you can see there is a directory by the name /softwares which did not exist earlier. I'll clear the screen, go inside the /softwares directory. I do the ls command. You can see that these are the files that existed in the global zone under the bundles directory. So we now have one of the directories of the global zone added to the non-global zone. I do a touch command here to create a 0-byte file f1, and as you can see, I'm not able to make modifications to this because we had set the options for this specific resource as read-only during the zone configuration command. So that takes us to the end of sharing a directory with the non-global zone. You have to keep in mind that the next few examples also are going to be very similar here. There is not much of a difference when it comes to the commands that we use, just that the type of the resource that we add would be slightly different. But remember the pattern. It's about add a specific resource type, then we get into the scope in the zone CFG command, and there you specify the attributes specific to that resource. On this global zone, I have a disk. It's actually not the reason why I'm not able to get any disks in here is because I am inside the non-global zone. So let me come out of the non-global zone, run the command zone name. I am in the global zone. Run the echo format command to list the hard disks that I have. C1 T0 D0 is nothing but my root disk. I have a disk that I've added. Of course, it's not a physical disk. In fact, it's just a virtual disk that I've added to my virtual box. The disk is C1 T1 D0, and I do have a slice created, which is S0, a partition created on the slice 0 of 1 GB. I'm going to assign this particular slice to the non-global zone. But before I do that, I will have to create a file system on this, which I do by running the command ufs. I'm not getting into the ZFS here. It's about creating a Unix file system, a UFS, and assigning the UFS file system to the non-global zone. So let me create a file system on the disk C1 T1 D0 on the slice S0. That is the slice I've created, or the partition I've created on this disk. It creates a new file system. So I now have a file system ready with me on my disk C1 T1 D0 on the partition slice 0. I'm going to assign this to the non-global zone. Again, no prices for guessing here. The command that I would use is zone CFG and then add a resource. This time also the resource type is file system, just that the specific type of the resource that I'm adding is not LOFS but UFS. So let's go ahead and do that. Remember the name of the disk. It's C1 T1 D0 S0. So let me run the zone CFG command on zone A. I run the info command once just to see there are only 2 resources that I've added. which is file system 0 and net 0. File system 0 of course is my loopback file system. I would say add a file system, or maybe I'll just come out of it so that we have a clean screen in front of us. So it's zone CFG minus Z zone A. What I want to add is again a file system. You can see the scope has changed. We are inside the file system here. Last time we added a loopback file system. This time we want to add a Unix file system. Set special is the block device path of the disk of the file system that I just created, which is Dave DSK C1 T1 D0 S0. Set raw device file Dave RDSK C1 T1 D0 S0. Set dir is equal to /data, which is nothing but the mount point in non-global zone. You remember zone A does not have a mount point /data. We had verified this a few minutes ago by using the df-h command. So all I am now doing is to configure the zone A with a new file system, a UFS file system, and I want that file system to be mounted under /data directory within the non-global zone. So I say exit. Okay, I have to say end before I do exit. Now it commits the changes to the zone configuration file. We can verify that by running the command zone CFG minus Z zone A info. And now you can see there are two resources that are added as far as the file system is concerned. This is the resource that we just added. I have to remind you here that we are not touching the etc VFS tab file at all. In fact, /etc VFS tab file is long forgotten after ZFS came into existence. That's where we specify the UFS file system that needs to be mounted during the boot time. But we don't have to mention any of those details in etc VFS tab in this case, simply because it is a zone ADMD daemon which will read the zone's configuration file and mount this file system. etc VFS tab is not involved in here at all. I'll clear the screen and let's do a reboot. Zone ADM minus Z zone A reboot. Of course, you might have a concern rebooting your zone just because you added a UFS file system. If you cannot afford a reboot, I understand you may not be able to afford a reboot, then obviously you can run the mount command on the fly from the global zone to mount it. I will run that command once we just take a look at the file system mounted inside the zone A. So let's do a reboot. As I mentioned earlier, the reboot will take zones into different states like installed, ready, running. So let's wait for the prompt to come back when the zone A reaches the running state. And once we have the zone back, there you can see an FSCK was done on the file system that we added just now. In fact, such a message was never thrown at us when we rebooted the zone. Because we added a UFS file system to the zone A, it did an FSCK, a file system check, and now it reports to us that the file system is clean. Let's log into zone A and df-h. You can see that there is now a mount point called /data which never existed. And remember, I told you it's a 1 GB partition that I added on that disk on the slice 0. That's exactly what you get to see here. I go to /data and I do a df-h. I do a df-h dot. You can see that it's /data. I'm not able to see the device name, of course. I do an exit, get back to the global zone. One thing you might want to keep in mind here is that /data is the mount point of this file system inside the non-global zone. From the global zone, if you want to take a note of this mount point, it's actually not /data. It's going to be the zone path. So if I run the zone ADM list minus CV command, I get to see the zone path as /zones/zone A. So you go to /zones, zone A, root, this is where the data is. So from the global zone, /data of the non-global zone is the zone path /root/data. And for this reason, if you had to mount this from the global zone, you would have run a command similar to this. I would say Dave DSK C1 T1 D0 S0, and then I would have specified this mount point from the global zone. So if you wanted to mount it from the global zone without having to reboot your non-global zone, this is the way you generally do it. So I'll do a Control C. We have come to the end of adding a second resource to the non-global zone, which happens to be a Unix file system. So we added a loopback file system, which is a directory from the global zone to the non-global zone. We added a Unix file system. Obviously, we can't take the discussion around a file system to completion without talking about ZFS file system. So the next exercise is to add a ZFS file system to the non-global zone. So let's go ahead and do that. Let me list a file system here, ZFS file system here. You would remember this command, ZFS list. We had a separate session on the ZFS file system. So let's add one of these file systems to the zone. I would create a new one, maybe ZFS create rpool slash let's say zone file system. Okay, now let's run the command zone cfg, familiar command again, zone cfg minus z zone A. This time I want to add a file system. Again, in the last 3 examples, including this one, the resource type that we are adding, or the resource we are adding, is the file system, just that the type of the file system in here is different, which is ZFS. The first one was loopback file system, the second one was Unix file system. Now we are adding ZFS file system. One thing you might want to keep in mind here is that for the Unix file system, we mentioned the raw device file, because raw device file is where the file system check or the FSCK is done. But in here, when it comes to ZFS file system, FSCK has no meaning, so we don't have to add the raw device file here. So we say set type is equal to ZFS, set special. Special was always the case. You say special was the block device file for UFS file system. Special was a directory that we wanted to share from the global zone. In this case, special is nothing but rpool slash zone FS. That's the one which we created. Then we can specify the mount point, which is, let's say, set dir is equal to data01. We didn't have this directory created in the non-global zone. I say end, we had to say set dir is equal to slash data01 end exit. So we now have a third resource added to the non-global zone. In this case, the resource is in a ZFS file system. Let's see if you're able to get this file system there. I'm going to do a zone reboot. So I say zone adm minus z zone A reboot. Okay, now this is an expected error. The reason is very simple. When you create ZFS file system, the ZFS file system is mounted automatically. Now you can see that rpool slash zone FS, the moment I created it, it mounted rpool zone FS on the global zone. So the moment it is mounted in the global zone, obviously it is not to be made available in the non-global zone. So if you do not want rpool slash zone FS to be mounted automatically in the global zone, there is a property. Let's go to ZFS command get. You remember during the ZFS discussion, we mentioned that ZFS is a property centric file system. The mount point is set by property. There are so many other properties also that we discussed in the ZFS session. So let's look at the mount point property of rpool slash zone FS. Now it has a default mount point. So I want to change that default mount point to a value of legacy so that it is not mounted in the global zone and hence can be mounted in the non-global zone. So let me set it. ZFS set mount point is equal to legacy for rpool slash zone FS. Let me reiterate here one more time. Whenever you create a file system, ZFS file system, that file system gets automatically mounted under a mount point that defaults to the name of the ZFS file system. And because it got mounted in the global zone, I was not able to mount it under the non-global zone. So what we are trying to now do is to set the mount point of that file system rpool/zone fs to a value legacy, so that it is not mounted in the global zone and hence is available in the non-global zone. So we say df minus h. So you can see we don't have that file system mounted anywhere. Just take a closer look at all the mount points there. We no longer have the zone fs file system mount point. That's because we set the value to legacy. We can just verify that one more time. Get mount point for rpool/zfs zone fs. So that's set to a value of legacy. Let's look at the state of the zone. It's running. Of course it is running, but it did not mount the ZFS file system. We can go log into zone A, look at df minus h. There is no data 01 because it was not able to mount it. The mount point was not set to a value of legacy in the global zone. I'll clear the screen, exit out of it, run the zone ADM list minus CV command again, just to bring into your notice that now the ID of the zone has changed to 3, giving us a clear indication that the ID is not constant for the non-global zone. I'm going to now reboot the zone ADM minus Z zone A reboot. Last time we got an error saying that it was not able to mount the ZFS file system that we added because the mount point of the ZFS file system was not set to legacy. Now that we have set it to legacy, that ZFS file system is not mounted in the global zone, and hence the non-global zone is able to mount it inside. Once we have our prompt back, we can log into the zone A and do a df minus h command. Now you can see the data 01 that happens to be the ZFS file system we shared from the global zone. But if you do a ZFS list command, we do not get to see that ZFS file system from the global zone. So the features that ZFS gives us, like creating a file system under that file system, setting a quota for the file system, setting a reservation for that file system, we're not able to make use of any of those facilities because we added ZFS as a file system to the non-global zone. But if our requirement is different, if we want an ZFS file system to be added to the non-global zone, which gets listed as a part of the ZFS list command, where you want to set quota, where you want to create additional file systems, where you want to set reservations, where you want to set just about all properties you can think of in a ZFS, adding ZFS as a file system will not help. So let us get out of the zone and think of a different way of adding ZFS into non-global zone. And when we do that, obviously, we would get ZFS file system in the non-global zone, under which we can create additional file systems and we can set the properties for the ZFS file system. I'm going to create a new file system, ZFS create rpool/zone fs2. That's the name I want to create. So ZFS file system is created, and by the behavior of the ZFS file system, it's automatically mounted. Last time we tried to add that file system to the zone. While booting the zone, it gave an error indicating to us that the file system is already mounted and the mount point has to be set to a value of legacy. This time I'm again not doing that intentionally. Let us see what happens if I don't do it. I'm going to run the zone CFG command for the zone A because I want to add one more resource. So far we added 3 resources. All the resources were of the same nature. One was the LOFS file system, the second one was the UFS file system, the third one was the ZFS file system. This time I want to add a resource. See the command, it's the same, add a resource. What resource do we want to add? Add a data set. That's what we want to add. We usually use the word data set and file system interchangeably when it comes to ZFS, but at least in this context there is a very clear difference between FS and data set here. Add data set. What is the data set that you want to add? I want to add rpool/zone fs2, and I say end. There is nothing more that you need to do. You're adding an ZFS data set to the zone A. I do an exit out of it. It is obviously saved. I can run the command zone cfg -z zone A info to say, now we have a very evolving file here. It's growing. We now have an additional resource, which is dataset. That's nothing but the ZFS file system. I have to remind you that we haven't set the property mount pointer legacy. Last time when we tried booting or rebooting the zone, it gave a warning, it gave an error message saying that I would not be able to mount this because the mount point is not set to legacy. We haven't done that for this data set. Let's go ahead and reboot the zone and see what happens. I do a reboot. Let's see what happens. Last time we got an error. Obviously, a reboot takes a few seconds. We're going to get the prompt back if there is no error. Let's see if we would get the same error we got earlier. Earlier we added an ZFS file system. This time around we added a data set, but we did not set the value mount pointer legacy. So apparently it did not give me an error. Let me log into zone A. I'm inside zone A. Verify that by using the zone name command. df-h obviously will give me all the mount points in the file system. But what I'm interested in this time around is the command ZFS list. As you can see, there is a ZFS file system that is now available within the non-global zone. This is clearly the difference between adding ZFS as a file system and adding the data set of the ZFS. Now I have control here. I can actually say ZFS create zone fs2 myfs. Maybe there is a spelling mistake. Zone fs2 / myfs. You can treat it like other ZFS file systems. You can set quota. You now say ZFS list. You now have a child file system created. I can go inside zone fs2 and say myfs. I say ls df-h dot. You can see that now I could create a ZFS file system within that. So that's the difference between adding ZFS as a FS resource and adding ZFS as a data set. Now the only question that remains to be answered is that when we added ZFS as a file system to the non-global zone and booted the non-global zone, it gave an error saying that the mount point property should be set to legacy for this to work. But we added ZFS dataset resource to a zone, it did not complain about the mount point property. Now there is another property. Remember, when we learn ZFS, it's all about learning the different properties that the ZFS has. I think we are now familiar with a number of properties of the ZFS file system. Add to it one more property that we are learning here, which is ZFS get zone D for rpool / zone fs2. You can see that the value of the zone D property is set to on for this particular file system. Maybe we can try that for zone fs. The value of the zone D is set to off for the zone fs. The moment you have the value set to on, it actually indicates that this particular file system, this particular data set of ZFS belongs to a zone. Obviously, it will not be used from the global zone. So when you add a data set using the add data set of the zone CFG command, zone D property value is set to on for that specific data set, ZFS data set. So obviously there you don't have a reason to set the mount point value to legacy that. I have to mention a word of caution here. If you remove this data set from the zone later, this particular flag is not cleared. You will have to clear it by running the ZFS set command. So far we added 4 resources to our non-global zone. One was the directory from the global zone. The second one was the UFS file system. The third was ZFS as a file system. The fourth one is ZFS as a data set. I'm going to log into the zone A. Let me find out how much memory does the zone have. So that's around 3 GB, which actually is the memory that I have assigned to my Solaris global zone. So it's consuming all of it. If I run a program which eats up all this memory, there is no one who would stop it from doing it. So that's kind of unfair, because if there are other zones that are running on my global zone, one zone consuming the entire physical memory is certainly not a fair option there. So I want to restrict the usage of physical memory within the global zone. There are multiple ways of doing it. There are many complicated ways of achieving this. Probably we would discuss the simplest one, and that simplest one is by running the command zone CFG again. You remember we are setting resources to the zone A, the pattern is not going to be any different. The pattern is going to be set capped hyphen memory. That's what I want to do. I want to set a capping on the memory. It's add. Maybe I'll exit out of this, run the zone CFG command again. Maybe I got a little excited there. It's add capped hyphen memory and set physical memory to, let's say, 512 MB. Set swap to 512 MB. And I say end, exit. So it would set a capping of 512 MB within the non-global zone. If you want, you can lock certain amount of physical memory in the non-global zone by using another attribute called locked is equal to true. And now that I've made modifications to the configuration file, I would do a reboot of my zone. Again, if you do not want to do a reboot, there is a command called rcap_adm which you can perform. rcap_adm, specify the name of the zone, specify the amount of memory that you want to assign to the zone. So that would look something like this, zone A 512M. We can in fact verify whether our rcap_d daemon is running or not. svcs -a grep rcap. It's disabled. There are multiple ways of enabling this. You can either run the command svcadm enable system/rcap:default, or you can say rcap_adm -e. That's probably the easiest way of enabling rcap daemon. We can now look at it and see that the rcap daemon is online. Maybe we will modify the memory in the zone A on the fly dynamically. We can run the command rcap_adm -z, name of the zone, zone A 512M. I hope the syntax of this command is correct. So that's rcap_adm -z, name of the zone is zone A -m 512M, maximum residence size. So I would set it to 512M, and now let's log into the zone A and run the prt-conf command grep for physical memory. You can see that the physical memory is now restricted to 512 MB. In any case, if I reboot the zone is only going to get 512 MB because we have modified the zone configuration also. I would exit out of it. Let's look at the zone CFG -z zone A info command to see what is there in it. You can see there is one more resource that's added. RCTL stands for resource control, and what I've added there is a limit on the memory usage there. 512 MB is all I've added to the non-global zone, and we saw how to do that on the fly as well. The last resource that we want to take up here, let's log into zone and look at how many CPUs the zone has. It has 2 CPUs. I don't want to give 2 CPUs to the zone here, so I would exit out of this. Run the zone CFG command again, maybe clear the screen and run the zone CFG command again. The pattern is not going to be different. We looked at the pattern a number of times today. So say add. This time around we want to add a dedicated -CPU, and you can see the scope of the command has now changed to dedicated -CPU, and now you say set the attribute specific to dedicated -CPU, which is number of CPUs is equal to 1. I say end and exit. So no difference in the pattern there. I'm adding a resource. The name of the resource is dedicated -CPU. Set the number of CPUs to 1. End it. I reboot the zone. Zone A reboot. And let's see what happens. There is a daemon called pool D daemon, and there are commands like pool CFG and pool ADM command that can be used to manage the CPUs inside a non-global zone. It's a very lengthy discussion to have. Those are traditional ways of managing resources within the operating system and now within the zone, of course. So in case if you're interested, those are some of the additional homework you can do to read through the pool CFG command, pool ADM command, pool D daemon, what it does, etc. Now that we have rebooted the zone, let's log into zone A, and we run the psr info command to see how many CPUs exist in there. We had 2 CPUs earlier. Now it has only one CPU because we have set the number of CPUs to 1. So I hope this has given a fair bit of idea on how to manage resources within a zone. You might want to keep in mind that the pattern of the zone CFG subcommands looks very similar. We add a resource and then we specify or set the resource specific attributes. For further study on this, the best documentation that I can recommend to you is the man page of the zone CFG command. Every other documentation that you can find on the World Wide Web is in fact a tailored version of the zone CFG man page, because this particular man page has examples. All the examples that we looked at are all detailed in the man page of the zone CFG command. So in case if you want to play around with zones, add more and more number of resources, play around with resources, zone CFG by far is the best documentation that I can think of. You can see there are plenty of examples in here wherein you can control the resources within a zone. So I want to take a moment to thank you and hope to see you soon.